Hello then, Year 8. So our next lesson is all about how did slavery come to an end, both in Britain and in America. So towards the end of the 1700s, many people began to believe that despite the fact that slavery had made lots and lots of plantation owners incredibly wealthy, it had been very beneficial for Britain, many began to believe that it was wrong. And there were a couple of different ways that people began to approach this. The great economist Adam Smith believed that slavery in and of itself was inefficient. It was not economically prudent for governments to be involved in it, simply because having a group of unpaid workers who never earned any money and therefore could never spend any money meant that the benefits of the wider economy were neglected. Other people came at it from a more religious viewpoint, particularly the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, and Granville Sharp, who both took the view that it was not morally acceptable to enslave fellow human beings because we were all the children of God and everyone is worthy of respect. So over the course of many, many years, beginning in 1786, the Abolition Society was formed and many MPs began to speak out against the practice of slavery, and there was even the beginnings of a boycott on goods produced by slaves. So, the meetings begin to occur and some very, very powerful and wealthy people begin to get involved, and they begin demanding not just the abolishment of slavery itself, but also the abolition of the slave trade. Famously using images like this one to show how inhumane the slave trade really was, packing hundreds and hundreds of people into ships and then transporting them across the Atlantic Ocean. And especially in the early years of the slave trade, 25% of all the slaves who made the journey, or were forced to take the journey, ended up dying en route. So it was incredibly costly in human lives. So you end up with this particular one, sort of advertisements advocating that our products are made without slaves. This one is for East India sugar, so referring to sugar made in the Caribbean that was not made by slaves, instead it was made by free people. Almost like a modern day version of fair trade, if you will. This is sort of the very, very early things that they began to do. On the more religious side, many of these buttons were produced. And on it we have our slave in his chains underneath saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Indicating that as we're all children of God, and we're all human beings and worthy of respect, how could you do this to someone like this? So the religious aspect played a large role in the emancipation of slavery. The economic aspect played another role, combined with the rebellions that I talked about last lesson. And this sort of three-pronged approach meant that slavery eventually, firstly the slave trade and then slavery itself, is abolished in 1833. So by 1833, all slaves on British plantations throughout the Caribbean and other parts of the world they're made free. But it was a lot more complicated than that. The slave owners themselves were given compensation due to a loss of property, i.e. because their slaves had been their property and they no longer owned them, the slave owners were compensated. And the slaves had to serve a 7-year apprenticeship before they were fully free. So it wouldn't be until the 1840s that many black people in the Caribbean actually attained full freedom. America, however, proved a very, very different case. Despite slavery being outlawed in the 1830s throughout the British Empire, slavery would not be abolished in America until 1864 and 1865. They even fought the American Civil War, which formed part of the issue. You had the northern states in America whereby slavery was illegal and where many slaves in the South attempted to escape, and you had the southern part of the United States where slavery was legal and practiced. There were a number of other issues that led to the Civil War, but we'll stick with slavery just to simplify everything. This war ended up being incredibly costly. It was the first war where you had modern weaponry, including machine guns, machine guns of a kind, Gatling guns. You also had lots and lots of muskets and rifles, and you had large numbers of men charging towards one another. At the same time, you also had cannons. So not only were they had a real serious problem whereby the weapons of war for the time were very sophisticated, but the tactics were not. Tactics tended to be, we're just going to charge that opposing group of soldiers and hope they win. And on many battles, tens of thousands of people were killed, and it proved to be a very horrific war. Now in 1860, just before the war began, a man named Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States. This caused tension because Lincoln wanted to end slavery, so the South broke away, and for the next 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, the war would be fought. In 1863, in the midst of the war, Lincoln signed something called the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all of the slaves, even the ones in the South. But it wouldn't be until the war ended in 1865 that this could finally be carried out. In 1868, the United States Constitution was amended, making black Americans fully fledged US citizens with voting rights, at least in theory, and I'll come across that a little bit later. Following the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction whereby they were attempted to rebuild the South, which had been ravaged by the war. There were the introduction of something called black codes. These were laws which prevented black Americans from doing particular things. And many black Americans were also not allowed into various shops and things like that. So there were a strict set of rules that black Americans had to follow, otherwise they could get in trouble. Towards the end of the Civil War, there was also the formation of something known as the Ku Klux Klan. This was a group of former soldiers, at least that's how it started out. They wore these white robes with white hats that covered up their faces, and they would terrorize black people in various communities. They would shoot them, firebomb their houses, and things like that. They burnt this cross. The burning cross became their symbol. Now, the Klan believed it was a Christian organisation. However, they don't behave in a Christian way. So for them, burning of the cross was the idea of the light of Jesus shining out into the world. But it proved to be an incredibly brutal and incredibly horrific organisation. It was very difficult to prosecute them for these crimes of murder because so many judges were also members of the Klan or had sympathies for them. So from the end of the American Civil War in 1860, for the next 100 years or more, right the way through to the 1960s, the Klan would intimidate and attack black Americans for being black. The final bit is all about the Jim Crow laws. Now, these were laws that were implemented in order to keep segregation between blacks and whites. So in this one, an example, this is at a train station, and they use the term the coloured waiting room. So white people had one waiting room where they would wait for their train, and the blacks, or in this case they use the term coloured, would have to go somewhere else. And their facilities were usually of a lower quality, and it wasn't just things like train stations. There was sort of segregated water fountains. Black people had to enter through the backs of restaurants rather than through the front door. The same with shops and things like that. Eventually, by the time you get to the 1960s, these laws are eventually struck down by the Supreme Court in the United States, making segregation illegal. But it took an incredibly long time, and there was a lot of resistance on the part of Americans in the South for this. And finally, from the beginning of the 1880s right the way through to 1968, nearly 5,000 people were lynched in the United States. It mostly took place in the South. The majority of them were black people. And what a lynching is you'd have sort of a mob that would go in and sort of perform an arrest of a kind on someone, drag them outside, and then hang them from a tree. And it would be sort of this grand public spectacle. So as you can see here, We have this is a black man being hanged from a tree, and we have all of the crowd watching on as if this was some form of entertainment. So this was an incredibly horrific thing that occurred. To be a black person in the American South during this period, at any point in time, you could have been lynched. You didn't even have to have done anything. It could be a case of mistaken identity. And there's no chance of the police or the law coming to your aid. The courts aren't going to help you because so many people are sympathetic to it. So, for lesson 5, you've got a bunch of different questions, some involving sources, and then others. The final extended writing task is sort of an essay style question. So you need to make sure you write plenty for that. Make sure you keep sending in all of your evidence to your class teachers so they can tick you off their list. So, thank you very much, Eric.